The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents The Tower of Babel. Recently, someone sent me a link to an article where I believe it was a Catholic theologian who was kind of addressing Jordan Peterson's remarks about the Tower of Babel, and they wanted to know what I thought. And I've spoken about the Tower of Babel before. This is really interesting to me on a number of different levels. Because the story itself is already a bit of a curiosity. It's something that when I was a believer, we had a certain, I don't know, we had thoughts about it then as to what it actually meant. In the case of Jordan Peterson, it's not surprising that he would look through this passage and find meaning, and it's also not surprising that he would find meaning that is consistent with his other views. This is, if anything, this video probably isn't so much about the Tower of Babel, although we are going to go through it, as it is about the process by which we seek to find meaning, and in particular hidden meaning in passages. Peterson's view of this was that the ancient Israelites were essentially trying to build a structure that was so large and encompassing that it could replace heaven itself. This is at least partially in line with what you'd get as a standard apologetic from any Southern Baptist I was sitting in church with. That is that these people were arrogant, they were trying to put themselves co-equal with God. Hey, we want this glorious city, we want people to recognize us, we want to stay together, we want to build a tower that goes into the heavens. And so this was sort of, when I was a kid, I was told that it was about trying to reach God, and this was a mistake, and God punished him. And that apologetic never really made any sense to me, because you can't reach God by building a tower. So, I mean, if I'm God and I'm sitting up there in the heavens and watching what's going on, and I see my little ant people trying to build a tower to reach me when I know that it's impossible, well, then I just let them figure that out on their own. Of all the lessons that you would think that it would be important for God to teach people, maybe this one isn't that high on the list. Maybe this is something that we can discover ourselves. Maybe it would be better to spend that time doing other things. But we read these stories. In Peterson's case, he loves the Jungian archetypes. He loves the notion of metaphorical truths and finding meaning in there and making things valuable and working on the self. And for him, this story is about the futility and danger even of trying to achieve a utopia. That we're gonna build heaven on earth, essentially, or replace heaven with our views. And whether or not he believes that a God actually came down and confused their languages and spread them, that's a completely separate issue. You can look at this as if it's just a story and say, hey, what's the moral to the story? That's pretty reasonable. The problem is, I'm not sure that people are fairly reading the text. And so I'm going to read the 9 verses that make up the story of the Tower of Babel, talk a little bit about where they are, and this process by which we might find out what the passage means. So open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. And I'm going to be reading from the King James because, as much as I like the NIV, it's copyrighted and I don't need any hassles. But you can go to BibleGateway.com or any number of other places and read this in a variety of different translations. There's nothing that fundamentally changes between these except whether or not they're easy to understand. Very beginning with verse 1, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they all have one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Curiously, and those are just 9 verses, and if you take a look at the story, essentially, verse 1 is everybody spoke the same language. Verse 2 is, hey, they were journeying, they settled in a plain. Verse 3 is they said, hey, let's get some brick and mortar. And then verse 4 is, let's build a city and a tower. And this is where the first potentially contentious point comes up, whose top may reach unto heaven. Now, depending on which translation you go with, by and large, this is just considered to be an idiom of building a tall tower into the heavens, into the clouds. It's really tall. It's just a way of saying we're going to build a tall tower. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're trying to reach heaven in this sense. It's not even clear that the ancient Israelites had that sort of understanding. They may have, they may not have. But you'll notice that nothing about this paragraph talks about them being arrogant, or specifically that they were trying to reach God or create heaven on earth or make themselves co-equal to God. A fairly fair, plain reading of the text tells a story like this. At this time, everybody was of one language, and they traveled east, they settled in a plain, and they said, hey, let us build a city here. Let us build a tower in this city. Why? Let us make a name so that we won't be scattered. They wanted to stay together, make a place that was theirs, a place that was recognizable, a place that they could, I guess, be proud of, and they start building. And then God who presumably knows that they could not possibly reach heaven, comes down and says, hey, look, these people are working together. They're building a city. They all speak the same language. If this keeps up, they can do anything they put their mind to. That's essentially what we're saying in verse 6. Behold, the people are as one, and they all have one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them that which they imagined to do. So these people have this spirit of cooperation to build something impressive, to build something that's of value to them, to stay together, to stay a cooperative unit. And God doesn't say, oh, how dare you try to reach me? He doesn't go down one of the apologetics line, which is, I told you to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth, and you're wanting to stay in one place. That, by the way, is one of the more common apologetics I've heard, when you point out that what God is objecting to here is not what we were taught as kids, and it's not what a lot of people, where's the arrogance? Where is this coming from? Well, they were disobedient. God wanted them to go out and spread and subdue the earth, and they decided to stay in one place. Yeah, but first of all, that's not what it says God's motivation was. And second of all, this is just one set of people. It's not the entirety of everyone on earth. We clearly are fine with the notion of building towns. And what it says is, if this continues, they're going to be able to achieve anything they imagine through this process of cooperation and communication. And God can't have that. And so what does he do? There's nothing about this that says, okay, I'm going to scatter you so that you'll spread out around the earth. You didn't listen to me about the scattering. There's the intentional, I'm going to confuse their languages and scatter them around the earth. And the reason given for that is because if the current trend continues with this cooperation and communication, there is nothing that they can't achieve. Why would a God not want people to achieve anything they can? Oh, well, he wants you to do what he wants you to do. That's fine. You can interpret it that way. It's not even that unusual for people to go through and interpret that. But for me, when we're looking for what the meaning of a passage is, there's one clear place that we should start every time. So the place for me to start is with a plain reading of the text. If someone tells you, go clean your room, and you start looking for hidden meaning in their message, it may be the case that that was code. Go clean your room could be code for, I don't know, who knows what it could be. But there might actually be a secret code there that you're finding with a hidden message for you. On the other hand, we should try to speak as plainly and accurately as possible when we can. And when we are presented with something and we're trying to understand it, the first stop should always be, what does it actually say? What was the message that was conveyed? And how clear is it? And in this passage, you have 9 verses, and there's a couple of curious things about these verses that I'll get to in just a second. But what it clearly says is people had the same language. Looks like they were going to be able to achieve anything they put their mind to. God came down specifically with the intent of putting a stop to that, muddled up their languages, and spread them out into the world. I don't know that there needs to be more of a hidden meaning there about potentially seeking utopia. I don't know that there's a justification to read into this that God was punishing them for their arrogance, or for trying to be godlike, or for trying to build a tower that reached heaven, rather than just an idiom that suggested that it was a tall tower. There's really no instruction here, and this passage, I think, does not belong. This passage, these 9 verses, completely interrupt a narrative that is otherwise fairly clear. It's like this little nugget was dropped in there. And I'll show you, because this is after the flood. And if you can go out and search. You can search some Bible timelines and find the guesstimates, because they, of course, claim that Noah lived for, 350 years after the flood, for a total of 950 years. Probably we'll do a video on this ridiculous age claim that we have for Noah and other stuff, which I think renders the Bible at least clearly untrustworthy at its face. But after the flood was over and the waters receded, Noah, one of 8 people left on the planet, if you buy into the notion of a global flood, and not all theists do, not all Bible believers do. Some of them view it as a local flood, although that's a problem as well. But Noah lived for another 350 years. So how much time was there between the flood and the Tower of Babel? Most of the timelines I found had it at 175, 200 years, something in that range. So on most of the timelines, Noah is still alive at the time that the Tower of Babel's built, or is ostensibly being built. And it's curious to me that, I've talked before about how the Old Testament is like a parade of God's failures. He creates men and it goes wrong and it goes wrong and it goes wrong. And he keeps trying to fix it, and every time he fixes it, it goes wrong. And then he destroys everybody except for 8 people, Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. That's 8 people to repopulate the world. And yet it still goes wrong right off the bat. Now, even using some incredibly loose population expansion figures, within a couple hundred years of the flood ending, how many people could there have reasonably been on the planet? And would they actually be building a city? And would they have the resources and manpower to build something like a tower? It's just bizarre. But the reason I say that this passage interrupts the narrative is that if you read chapter 10, it's essentially a table of nations. What it does is it begins after the flood, and says this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood, because, it's all about the sons. The sons are important. And it lists the sons of Japheth, then it lists the sons of Ham, and then it lists the Semites, the sons that were born to Shem, and it gets down, and in verse 32, at the end of chapter 10, it says, these are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent, within their nations, from these nations spread out over the earth after the flood. Now that's the end of chapter 10. Then the first 9 verses of chapter 11 we've already gone through. That's the Tower of Babel. And then immediately after that, in verse 10, it says, these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And it continues there, and it says, and Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. And Arphaxad lived 530 years and begat Salah. And it goes through this process from Shem, leading all the way up to Abram. And the whole purpose of the second half of chapter 11 and the entirety of chapter 10 is to present a chronology, a genealogy that begins with Noah and leads to Abram. Hey, there was Noah, there was the flood. Noah had these sons. These sons built these nations and had these, but Seth is the path that leads us to Noah. So if you remove the Tower of Babel, those 9 verses at the beginning of chapter 11, what you get, and by the way, remember these things weren't written necessarily with clear chapters and divisions and verses. These were just writings. So it's not like we, here's 9 stanzas of this song. You can view it that way. But what you have is chapter 10 goes through, hey, here's what Noah's sons did. And then chapter 11 continues right where, at verse 10, right where chapter 10 left off with, and specifically, here's what Shem did. Here are Shem's sons that led us to Abram. So you have a story that does not make the accusations that many apologists do. Whether or not they're right, I can't tell you. Is there a right answer to what the passage means? Yeah, probably. Do we have a good reason to know what that right answer is? Maybe. If anything, I would argue that the clear, obvious meaning behind the passage is a post hoc explanation for why people have different languages. In chapter 10, where it talks about Noah's sons, it talks about, them having different languages. By the way, some people raise this as a contradiction. They say, hey, hang on. At the beginning of chapter 11, it says everybody spoke the same language. But in chapter 10, it talked about Noah's sons and how they were the fathers of their nation and their languages. So clearly they had languages before this. I don't find that to be a particularly good contradiction. I think the explanations afterwards make a lot of sense, which is, you can say these people lived and were the fathers of their languages and still have the incident that describes the separation of languages stuck in the middle of this narrative here. It doesn't make sense to put it in here if the purpose is to explain the spreading of people or a tower, but it does make sense if somebody's sitting around going, why do we all speak different languages? Why is it that, the flood happened and, just not even, you can't even really say generation or two later because these people are supposedly living for hundreds of years. How did we get different languages? Let me tell you, my son, about how language is formed. Because we don't need to tell our daughters anything. It's always about the sons. The people were of one language and they sought to do this, and then God changed all their languages, confounded them, and sent them out. It's clearly, in my estimation, a passage to describe the origin of language. From an historical point of view, from what we know and understand about how language is formed, it cannot be accurate. This is not how the diversity of languages is best explained, given all of the available evidence. That doesn't mean that I'm claiming it's not true, because the nice apologetics tap dance is that you could say this. Everybody spoke one language. God confounded the languages. And then some of those languages died off, and then the modern languages evolved from those broken languages. And that's the thing. You can't prove that that's not true. But at the end of the day, if I'm presented with a passage, rather than looking at it and saying, okay, this passage says that God wanted to confound our languages so that we couldn't cooperate and achieve good things, or couldn't achieve anything, or that nothing would be beyond our grasp, and it's inserted in between two verses about Shem and his sons, and it seems to be a way to explain why people speak different languages. Why do I need to dig further for meaning? And what justification can I have for saying God was punishing them for arrogantly thinking they could reach heaven? You might be right. You might be right that this is a passage warning about utopia. But if we look at it fairly, that is basically individuals reading into the passage whatever they want. And this is the reason why there are countless denominations of Christianity. This is the reason why there are varieties of Judaism. This is the reason why everybody has a different understanding of what this book is actually telling, because we inject our view into that. And it would be very tempting, and I've done this in the past, to say that what was being described here, communication and cooperation, seeking to stay together and continue the cooperation, seeking to build a city and a tower such that people would be able to see the city from a long ways off, that we may attract more people to our place, that we may, as we move around, always have a home that we can come to. These are essentially principles of secular humanism. The notion that we can communicate and cooperate and build the kind of world we want. And I could then argue that God is vehemently against secular humanism, to the point where when it started to rise the first time around Babel, that he came down and confounded their languages and scattered them around the earth because he can't stand that. I think that'd be as accurate as anything else, except I don't need to do that, because this weird 9-verse insertion is far more clearly a post hoc explanation for why people have different languages. It doesn't fit with the rest of the text. There's no reason to go seeking hidden messages in it. And I don't need to go to passages in the Bible about events that almost certainly didn't happen, that are preposterous fantasies constructed to explain things, in order to talk about whether or not the Christian God would be opposed to secular humanism. Because everything about the notion of the Christian God, of the Jewish God, of nearly every God is antithetical to the values of secular humanism. I don't need to go to your storybook and pull out a story and try and twist it to suit my needs. And yet this is exactly what Jordan Peterson has done, in the sense of, I have some insight into this passage, this story against a utopia. And it's what believers of other stripes have done, saying, this is what God was really doing. This is what God was really doing. Just read the passage. See what it says, plainly. And then if it's not clear, maybe you could look for some hidden meaning. But I think those 9 verses are pretty clear, no matter which translation you get. See you next time.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.